All right, hey, welcome back. We are here for another video. It's in continuation of our last video talking about f-stop, but today we're talking about shutter angle. Now, if you guys didn't already know this, I work in the film industry, been doing that for a long time, and I've worked on big movies, small movies, Jurassic World, Red Tails, Godzilla, some other movies, and so I feel like I kind of know what I'm talking about when I talk about this stuff. So I'm here to teach you guys and try to train you guys on how to use shutter angle to your advantage. Now, shutter angle and shutter speed are basically the same thing. One's in like a digital medium and one's in like a film medium. Now, with the film medium, shutter angle ends up being changed in a certain way, and rather than get too far into how a mirror is inside of some cinema cameras and it's spinning and projecting an image to a eyepiece and some other stuff, as well as allowing light to go through the mirror at times. Without going all into that, we're going to talk mostly about digital here, and mostly like people using cameras for streaming or creating YouTube videos or videos anywhere need to know mostly about shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is basically the same thing, but it's in a different measurement. Contrary to the f-stop, the lower the number of your shutter speed actually makes your image way blurry. Like your motion blur ends up looking like a security camera. Take a look at this video right here. This is shutter speed 1/10. Now that's 1/10 of a second that the image is being displayed for while it's trying to record an image. Now that's why it kind of looks stuttery and choppy, is because it's trying to leave the sensor open to light coming in for 1/10 of 1 second. So now take it a little bit in a different route here. Here is 160. Now 160 is a little bit more normal motion blur looking. Now for every 1 second, the sensor is allowing the light to hit the sensor for 1/60th of a second. And if we take it even further, now this one is 1/320th of a second. I'm talking about 320. 1/320th of a second. The image that is coming into the lens and hitting that sensor is hitting that sensor for 1/320th of a second. You're starting to see a lot more jarry looking imagery, something that looks like 28 days later, where, you know, everything is in focus. And let's take it to the real extreme. And here is 1/5000th of a second. Now this, my camera goes up to 1/8000th of a second, so you're not gonna see a big difference here, but just know that when you start to up that shutter speed or make it a higher, in a sense, number, it's technically smaller, but it's higher because of the number, you get it. So 1/5000th actually looks way more stuttery, and it's actually starting to make things have like almost no motion blur. Now this is good for very quick, fast-paced photography, maybe sports and action. So when you freeze the frame, there's no motion blur happening in the frame when you freeze it. So while I'm wiggling my hand right here and I freeze it, you can actually see that you can see everything. There's no motion blur. But if we go back to the 1/10 of a second and I hit the freeze, now you actually see that there is a lot of more motion blur, and that's maybe not what you want. So keep in mind that when you're working with cameras and whatnot, the normal amount of what your eye sees as motion blur is usually double your frame rate. Now, it gets a little bit weird when you start to change the frame rate, but generally within movies and whatnot, we shoot at 23.976 frames per second or 24 FPS. So when you're watching movies and whatnot, we usually have the shutter speed at something like 1/50th of a second. We usually double our FPS. So if we're shooting at 24, we double it, we get to 1/48th, but most cameras don't do 1/48th of a second. There's some weird algorithm, but you got between, 1/40th and maybe 1/50th. So we end up going towards the 150, and that makes it look a little bit more pleasing to the eye, more normal to see motion blur like how our eye sees it. So when it comes to shutter speed, it comes down to motion blur and what kind of motion blur you want to set. Now, if you want something that has a lot of motion blur to it, you got to lower that number. Now, if you want to keep it on the higher side of things, you're going to have more choppier looking imagery where maybe everything looks a little too sporty and maybe a little too active. Now, when you have it at a higher speed, something like 1/320th of a second, it maybe looks a little bit more frantic and kind of scary, whereas maybe something with a little bit more blur to it, something like 1/60th, maybe looks a lot more pleasing to the eye and kind of soft. So keep in mind that's what shutter speed does, and how to control it is usually just like a dial on your camera. Now, most cameras also on your phone have the same thing, shutter speed. So you might see it. It's usually shown as like 1/ and then a number, and that's generally your shutter speed. And the bigger that 1/ that number, how big that number is how much motion blur you're going to have. But generally, try to keep the motion blur set to double your frame rate, or at the very least, try to match your frame rate. So if you're shooting 60 FPS, set to 1/60th. If you're at 30 FPS, set it to 1/30th. But generally, try to double it when you are recording. That way, if you do have to slow things down, you will have a little bit more normal looking motion blur. So anyways, I will catch you guys on the next one. We got more things to talk about here, white balance and some other stuff. So I'll catch you guys on the next video. Hope you guys like this. Like and subscribe. And that's the end of this short tutorial. Hope you guys have a good day. I'll catch you in the next one. All right. Peace.